dimension. You know who is in control. You know who has 4 times.
Welcome to part 2 of my Metroid Retrospective. Now, if you don't know how the Metroid franchise went from here, then you'd expect me to talk about Metroid 64 right now. Well, if you do know how the Metroid franchise went from here, then why are you watching this video? You know how everything played out. Anyway, there was not actually a Metroid 64. The closest thing was Samus's appearance in Super Smash Bros. To those who are either curious or nostalgia blind, you might be wondering, why would Nintendo not make a Metroid game for the N64? Is it not the greatest system on the history of Earth? It's not like it underperformed and started a snowball effect of every Nintendo console since, underperforming with the exception of the Wii by some weird fluke of not being introduced when smartphones were relevant yet. Well, there actually was at least a conceptual Metroid 64, and it was discussed many times. The reason the game never happened, and I quote Yoshio Sakamoto himself, "I was actually thinking about the possibility of making a Metroid game for the N64, but I felt that I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the N64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid game at the time." Also, I know this isn't a direct answer to your question, but Nintendo at the time approached another company and asked them if they would make an N64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately they didn't have the confidence to create an N64 Metroid game that could compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved with Super Metroid. So the short answer is, the technology just wasn't there yet to make a proper 3D Metroid. But eventually, after an 8-year hiatus, we got the 4th installment of Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance, which was released in most parts of the world in November 2002 and in Japan in February of 2003. As you can see here by the opening cutscene, this game is much more story-heavy than the previous installments. And, as a side note, was also the last Metroid game that wouldn't act as some sort of prequel, and to this day is the latest point in the Metroid timeline. At least they don't have some multi-timeline bullshit like some other Nintendo franchise. What is the story, you ask? Well, it's a lengthy one, but what I got out of it is, Samus encounters and is infected by a parasite called X, which just happens to be the natural prey of Metroids. She is uninfected by it by using cells of Metroids, but she also gains some powers from this parasite X's infection. And then she has to fight off parasite X, and it creates some kind of clone of her called SAX, and then Adam tells her to use the Varia suit. Nah, I'm just kidding. We'll get to that one when we get to it. While I'll admit it's a cool story, it's a lengthy one, and as years go on, I find myself caring less and less about stories in video games. While the game does play very similar to Super Metroid, the gameplay takes a much more linear style than the first 3 games, a reverse Castlevania, if you will. Puzzle solving is also more prominent in this game, and just as in Super Metroid, this game introduces some new gameplay mechanics, such as grabbing ledges and climbing ladders. Before I talk about the next Metroid game, I feel I should talk about Retro Studios first, which is a first-party developer of Nintendo that was created to bring older and hardcore audiences to the GameCube. And originally, when the studio was first created, 4 GameCube games were put in development with this in mind. An untitled action-adventure game, an untitled car combat game which was codenamed Thunder Rally, an unnamed football game, and an unnamed RPG. Though eventually, during the development of all of these games, Retro Studios was also tasked with the development of the next home console Metroid game after Super Metroid. And eventually, the original 4 games that Retro was supposed to develop were cancelled in favor of the development of the next Metroid game. Although the engine to the action-adventure game was eventually used as the engine for Metroid Prime, which internationally was released on the same day as Fusion. When it was first announced that the next Metroid game would be a first-person shooter, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether it would be good, because they thought Nintendo was simply abandoning the old gameplay style and trying to copy Microsoft with Halo, which came out around the same time. But in fact, Metroid Prime had all the appropriate gameplay elements the previous games had, and was an equivalent 3D transition to Ocarina of Time in Mario 64. And the close-up and more realistic perspective further enhanced the lost and eerie mood that the previous games had. So all in all, it was a good game. So what's the story? Well, chronologically in the storyline, it actually takes place directly after the first game and takes place before Metroid 2. Nintendo just loves making them prequels, don't they? So what is that story exactly? I don't care about stories in video games. Read this. I don't know. After Prime and Fusion in 2001, we had Metroid Zero Mission in 2004, which was a remaster of the first Metroid but with more Super Metroid-style gameplay. You could attribute this to the trend of remastering games, which is now a very popular thing for companies to do to grab money. I mean, to pay tribute to fans of long-running video game franchises of varying genres. Which brings us to the last game of Part 2, Metroid Prime 2 Echos, which was released in November of 2004, and has very similar gameplay to Metroid Prime, obviously, but there are some minor differences. For instance, you can now screw attack in the game, and new beams introduced in this game actually take ammunition, which sucks. Oh, and there's also a light world and dark world, like in Link to the Past and Link Between Worlds, so that's something else. Overall, pretty good game. Well, this concludes part 2 of my Metroid retrospective. Tune in for part 3. It's going to be uploaded on August 6th, the actual 30th anniversary of Metroid. Yeah, that's right. I caught you, Fine Brothers. I caught you. You saw my video, said 30th anniversary, and you said, "Oh, we gotta do a 30th anniversary Teens React, don't we, to Super Metroid?" I saw that, Fine Brothers. I saw that. Yeah, you're sick of people plagiarizing you. I mean, that's not necessarily plagiarism. All I'm saying is, I saw that. You should subscribe for more retrospectives and other tasty stuff. Oh, and also, I saw all those Metroid retrospectives for the 30th anniversary, which just happened to be uploaded a week after mine was. I'm just saying, no funny business. No funny business.